Hello, I'm John Robbins, and I'd like to welcome you to a conversation with Dr. M. King Hubbert. Today, there are more than 33,000 health-related institutions in the United States, of which 7,174 are hospitals. The rest are nursing homes, mental health facilities, clinics, and outpatient centers. These institutions are very large consumers of energy, the equivalent of 400,000 barrels of oil per day, although most of this is actually derived from the use of natural gas. This represents 15% of the energy consumed by commercial facilities and over 1% of the total energy consumed daily in the United States. Therefore, these institutions are critically concerned with supply and any impending energy shortage. With me is Dr. M. King Hubbert, for many years a student of energy resources. With a PhD in geology and physics from the University of Chicago, Dr. Hubbert began a career which now spans 50 years, half of it devoted to research and development for the petroleum industry, and the other half equally divided between university teaching and work for the Illinois State and the United States Geological Surveys. He taught at Columbia University, Stanford University, and was a Regents Professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Throughout this half-century, Dr. Hubbert has been a continuous student of energy resources and their implications in human affairs. As long as 20 years ago, Dr. Hubbert was pointing out to his colleagues in the petroleum industry that the United States would probably reach its peak of petroleum production within 10 to 15 years. So the first question, Dr. Hubbert, is in order to better understand our discussion, could you give us a picture of the total world energy resources?
Yes, and I think it's very important that we understand that, because that is the background that we need in order to understand our present problems. Now, I have a chart that is designed to try to convey that information. This horizontal bar here, we can think of as being the surface of the Earth. Now, beneath the surface of the Earth, at mineable or drillable depths, there are certain huge stores of energy. One of those are the fossil fuels, coal and oil and natural gas. Another is geothermal, as earth heat. Others are nuclear materials that we get out of the Earth. Now, these are all stored energy. Now, the diagram above is an energy flow diagram. Energy is rather like water. It changes, it flows, it goes from one form to another without changing the total quantity. For example, it can change from light to heat to electricity to work, etc.
Yeah.
So this diagram above, there are three inputs into the Earth's surface environment from outside. One of them is the solar radiation, the sunshine intercepted by the Earth's diameter. There's another, tidal energy, coming in from the Earth-Moon system, the Sun-Earth-Sun-Moon system that causes the tides and so on. Then there's heat coming out of the ground. Now, it's very important to appreciate the magnitudes of these three quantities. The unit we're going to use to measure this is power, and the unit is a watt, the same kind of watt you pay your electric light bill for. And so the heat coming from the sun, intercepted by the Earth, is 174 trillion thermal or heat watts. The energy coming to the Earth from the tidal system is only 3 of these units. 3 trillion thermal watts. The heat coming out of the ground is only about 32 or so. And so if we compare these inputs, the solar energy is roughly 5,000 times the sum of the other two. It's the largest source of energy available to this Earth in the past, the present, or in the future. Now, what happens to this energy? Well, in the case of the solar, about 30% of it does nothing to the Earth. It simply goes out.
Reflects back.
It reflects or scatters. As visible radiation. That's the reason we can see the Earth from the spacecraft. It's this light coming off. Now, the rest of this is absorbed by the Earth, and it does the things that happen on the Earth. That is, all of the material changes on the Earth is because of this energy. So about roughly half of it simply heats the atmosphere, the ground, and keeps the equitable temperature in the oceans. Another fraction, roughly a quarter of it, this input, evaporates water and circulates the water, is responsible for stream flow, for rainfall, and that kind of thing. And then there's another fraction that produces the winds and the waves and the ocean currents, etc. And finally, a very small fraction of this, less than 1%, is captured by the green leaves of the plants and drives a chemical reaction whereby common inorganic materials like carbon dioxide and water are synthesized into sugars, starches, and other chemicals in which the energy is stored chemically. Now, that is the source of the sole biological energy of the whole plant and animal system of the earth, including ourselves. In fact, we're right here. We eat the plants, and this is our biological source of energy. So that this sequence, now all of these channels, incidentally, the end product, they all go to heat, low temperature heat. After that, it leaves the earth by a long wavelength, or heat radiation, thermal radiation. So it's a flow system. It goes in, it goes out. As a consequence, it stirs the materials of the earth in the process. Now, there's one small exception to the part that's going out, and that is at the present time, plants, for example, in peat bogs is a good illustration, and other similar situations, they cannot completely decay because there's not enough oxygen, and so they're preserved. Now, that's been going on geologically for hundreds of millions of years, and these have gotten buried under accumulations of sands and muds and limes, and they have become our fossil fuels, coal and oil and natural gas. These are accumulations over, these deposits actually have spread over roughly 600 million years of accumulation. Now, there's other sources of energy inside the earth. There's the heat, geothermal, and that comes to the surface, and then there's also nuclear materials. Now, that is essentially the Earth's total energy system that we have to work with.
And right now, it's basically the fossil fuels because the industrial world is almost totally dependent on fossil fuels.
Yes, the industrial world, the contrast between, say, modern civilizations and all past civilizations prior to 1,000 years ago is that we are heavily dependent upon metals and fossil fuel energy, whereas in the past, well, it was primarily biological energy. It was manpower, animal power, and things of that sort.
Well, what's the picture on coal, for instance?
Well, the mining of coal is a continuous enterprise. Began in England, near Newcastle, about 900 years ago.
900 years ago?
Yeah, and we've been mining coal in Newcastle ever since that time, except I think there was about a 3-week recess about 2 years ago when they had a 3-week strike. They've been mining coal continuously, or digging it out of the ground for that time. Now, in the case of the United States, which we're directly concerned, this began much later. We started mining coal in the United States just about 1800. And here's the growth of coal production. Look at this spectacular rate of growth up until, say, World War I. Then after that, from the 20s on, we've oscillated over a figure here of the order of plus or minus 500 million tons per year, plus or minus. Now, this is all kinds of coal. This is anthracite, bituminous, and lignite. Now, I've taken the anthracite out. This occurs in only 2 small areas, principally eastern Pennsylvania, a little bit in eastern Virginia. Now, this is a smokeless coal. It's very hard, and it's almost pure carbon. And it used to be required by law that they could only burn anthracite in the eastern cities, New York and so on, because it was smokeless. Now, this is very interesting specialty. I've shown this specialty, and that is that we began producing mining anthracite back around 1830 or so. And note this steady rise, growth, and we hit a peak about 1918. And then look at the continuous decline almost back to zero.
This means running out of anthracite.
Yeah, or either that or it's so difficult to mine that we quit. We just about quit. So this illustrates what I call a complete cycle of exhaustion of a fossil fuel, say. It's not replaced by anything that's happening today or will happen in the next 1,000 years.
Right.
All we're doing is taking it out of the ground, burning it, and there's only so much there when we start it.
What about oil now?
Well, here's the corresponding picture on U.S. production of oil. Actually, oil is very much more recent than coal in the beginning. Commercially, industrially, the production of oil began in 1857 in Romania. 2 years later, in 1859, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, when the first oil discovery, and a well 69.5 feet deep. From that time on, here's actually from 1880, shows the U.S. growth of the U.S. annual production of oil. And again, there's setbacks. There's a depression. There's a little bit in World War II. And this little thing here coincides with the original Suez crisis. It's a Middle East disturbances kind of showed up in here. Now, there's the growth of oil production in the United States up until that's actually 1971, that last point there.
Well, now, how can we know whether we can continue this kind of growth rate? There's nothing in this figure that says we can't.
That is true. And so I'd like to give you an idea as to how we go about answering such a question. Think back a moment to that anthracite curve that I just showed you.
Yes.
We started at zero. There's some time when we began first producing. We grew exponentially for a while. We slowed down. We hit a peak, and then we started in a long decline. Ultimately, we'll go back to zero. That is the type of history of the production, exploitation, exhaustion of any non-replaceable resource. And now, this is just a schematic curve. It's not an actual data, but it shows the principles. Now, there's another part of this curve, and that is that the area beneath that curve at any given time, like my pointer to the left, that area is graphically proportional to the cumulative production, that is to all we've produced up to that time.
Yes.
Now, the scale of this area is one of these squares on this graph. And that square has a certain interval of production and a certain time, and the product of these two tells you how much of this quantity, or I'll say, would be produced at this rate and in this time. Now, if we could estimate, say, how much ultimately there may be of oil or coal, then this curve could only encompass an area that corresponded to that quantity. For example, if we could estimate what this ultimate quantity was, and we know how much is represented by one square, we can compute then exactly how many squares we could put under that curve. So then we couldn't draw this curve to encompass any larger area than their estimate. If we didn't have this constraint, this curve, our tendency at this stage, you see, suppose we were here, we'd tend to draw that on up to the sky, and we'd come with a very false conclusion.
But you've got limits to deal with.
Yeah, but when we can get at this figure and utilizing this principle, we can construct approximately this complete cycle, even though we're only in the first stages of development. Now, I'd like to illustrate this with coal. Coal is a fairly easy thing to estimate because it occurs as stratified beds. They crop out on the surface of the rocks along the Appalachian Mountains and elsewhere. And by geological mapping, we can determine where the coal beds are, and by a bit of drilling, we can determine about how much coal there is in any given area. This has been done all over the world, and this is a compilation made by Hubbert of the Geological Survey a few years ago of about how much coal there is in the world. Now, these figures are 50% of what he estimated the coal in the ground to be, on the assumption that we could maybe get half of it out of the ground by mining.
Yes.
So what in this diagram, this scale going this way, is trillions of metric tons. A metric ton is a little over our conventional short ton, about 10% over. And this adds up to about a little over 7 or 7.6 trillion metric tons. This yellow, or this first block here, is Asia. The second one is North America. The third is Europe, Western Europe. And the last one is 3 entire continents of South and Central America, Australia, and Africa. Now, what we see then at a glance is that the coal is by no means uniformly distributed around the world. Here's 3 entire continents which have very little coal. Now, in North America has about 30% of the world's total, about 2/3 of which is the United States. So we're very well endowed with coal in proportion to our area. Well, our estimated figure here was nearly 1,500 billion metric tons. And we'll look at the next figure here and utilize that principle that we described earlier, that complete cycle, and try to get some notion of about the time scale. That is, how long will this last? Well, in this particular graph, one square here represents 1 billion tons per year by 100 years, or 100 billion tons. Now, we had nearly 1,500 billion tons here. That means that we could only put 15 squares under this curve. Now, this curve must be drawn back to zero, but it cannot encompass more than 15 squares for this figure. Well, you could draw it higher. If you did, you'd have to come down quicker. And this is drawn on the assumption of maybe 3 more doublings, or of the rate of production, or about 8-fold increase, which is probably about as much as we can go, or maybe more.
Yes.
Now, however, there's another figure here based on only about 400 billion tons. Now, that is This first curve involves beds of coal as thin as a foot thick and as deep as a mile or more.
Hard to get at.
Yes, that's not very good coal mining. This lower curve is based on beds that are not less than 28 inches thick and not over 1,000 feet deep, which is more practical coal mining. Well, that's much smaller. It reduces to about a quarter of it of the figure.
Yes.
Now, from these two figures, we get a pretty good idea of about how long we can count on coal as a major source of energy. Forget about the first 10% that took a long time, the last 10% which will take a long time, and look at the middle 80%. Well, that's a spread in here, depending on which curve we look at, of between, say, 200 and 300 years. So if we take the lower figure here, we're likely to hit the peak within, well, we'll say about 2100, pretty close to. If we took the larger figure here, why, it would be closer to 2200 or so. Now, that gives us a kind of a feeling. If you took one single figure as to about how long will coal represent a major source of energy, then you could say probably not much over 300 years, maybe less.
From today.
Yeah.
Now, in 1956, you made a rather startling prediction that regarding U.S. oil, we would probably peak within 15 to 20 years. What did you base that prediction on?
Well, it's the kind of reasoning that I've just been through applied to oil. Now, at that time, they published literature by the leaders of the petroleum industry, leading oil geologists and engineers, estimated that the ultimate amount of oil that would be produced in the United States would probably be about 150 billion barrels, including past production, past plus future. There was one high figure by a consulting firm, a prestigious consulting firm of the oil industry, for about 200 billion barrels. That was a high figure. The evidence at the time indicated that this figure, this uncertainty, was probably within this bracket. Now, at that time, it was 97 years since oil was originally discovered in Pennsylvania, just a shade under a century. During that approximately 100 years, we had produced just over 50 billion barrels of oil. Now, this was known to everybody. But look at the reasoning. If we've only produced about 50 billion barrels in 100 years, and if we have 100 billion barrels still to go, which is twice that amount, how long will it be before there's an oil shortage? Or if you have 3 times that amount still to go, 150 billion barrels, how long would that be before you have an oil shortage?
It would seem you have quite a bit left.
Well, the interpretation, the kind of thinking on this is what you may be doing right now, and that is that plainly there isn't going to be any oil shortage anytime soon. In fact, the general thought was maybe our grandchildren's day, but certainly not our lifetime. Now, utilizing the principle we just described, one of these squares here is 1 billion barrels per year by 25 years, or 25 billion barrels. Now, if this 150 billion barrel figure should be about right, there could only be 6 squares under this curve before it goes back to 0. And we've used 2 of them already, a little over 2. So what about? Well, we've got 4 at the outside and still to go. Now, we can't go up to a peak and drop down. We have to go down gradually because this oil still has to be found and got out of the ground, both of which are slow processes. So then it became practically impossible to draw that curve in any significantly different manner from what I've shown here. This is the figure that I used in that paper in 1956. But look at the date of the peak. It will be about 10 years hence. Not in our grandchildren's day, but in our time.
Right.
Now, well, what would happen if we said, well, let's look at the large figure? Well, that would be another 50 billion barrels or 2 more squares. But where do you put them? We've already used up 6 down here, so we have to put the 2 more out here. We have to draw this curve a little higher, bring it down over here, and there's the 2 more squares right here. How much does that delay the peak? About 5 years.
Well, now that was 20 years ago.
The conclusion in 1956 to an audience of petroleum engineers, about 500 petroleum engineers, that if these figures are approximately correct, or if this unknown quantity falls within this bracket, and the evidence indicated it probably would, the U.S. will hit the peak of oil production in about 10 or 15 years from that date.
Okay, now, where are we today? Has it all been confirmed?
That prediction proved to be rather startling and in many cases somewhat distressing to people in the petroleum industry. The first reaction was of incredulity. Could possibly be so. Well, where are we today? This is as of 1972, actually 70 and 71. So this curve has gone on up now. That little peak there is the year 1970, and we're down in 1971, and we have 4 more years since then. And we've been going down about 5% per year ever since. So that peak date actually happened in 1970. And this dotted curve here is the approximate average, drawing it so you avoid just cut off the peaks, is about so. Now look at the middle 80%. This first 10%, which would be 17 billion barrels, took up to around the middle 30s or so to produce. The next 80% will take, by this curve, till almost the end of the century, about 1999 and 98 or so. That spread of the middle 80%, the time span is about 67 years. That says that a child born in the middle 30s, if he lives a normal life expectancy, will see the United States consume most of its oil during his lifetime. Now, another major source of energy, in addition to crude oil, is natural gas. Now, there isn't time to discuss natural gas, except to say that natural gas has the same properties, except it's a little bit behind oil. So we hit the peak of natural gas in 1973, 3 years later than oil. But it has happened, and we're going down in our natural gas production, which is of considerable interest to the consumers of natural gas.
Well, now, what's the corresponding picture for the world with petroleum?
Well, the world picture, I can just, again, summarize it. These are approximately average estimates of a dozen or so published reviews made by international oil geologists or oil companies in the last 10 or 15 years. This particular estimate was by Dr. Jodrey of Sun Oil Company, but it's close to an average figure. All right, that adds up to, these particular figures added up to 1,952 billion barrels for the ultimate for the world. Geographically, they break down to these columns. The first one is North America, the second one is South America, the next is non-communist Europe, Africa, the Middle East, the USSR, and other communist countries, and the Asia-Pacific region. The shaded areas here is the amount that's already produced. The blank area is the estimated future production, future recovery. Now take a look at North America. North America represents only 15% of this total. The big oil reserves of the world are these big blank areas in the USSR and the Middle East and Africa and so on. But until last year, the United States was the largest producing company in the world. We're higher than all the Middle East, the individual Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia and so on.
Yes.
U.S. But we didn't have so much oil to begin with. We're also the largest consumer. In fact, we're importing about 37% of the oil we're consuming right now because our production is only about two-thirds of, or less than two-thirds of our requirement. Now, so what? We're about halfway through, and we're starting to decline. We're the largest consumer. Our quantity wasn't very large, the largest producer, and we're naturally running out the soonest. Now, to this complete cycle for the world, to give you a time scale on that, bear in mind that started in 1857. And so here's where we were about 3 or 4 years ago. This was proved reserves in here, which would add up to about here. And the estimated peak would occur about 1995, and we go into the decline. That middle 80% again is spread from the 60s, the late 60s, up till a little over 20, beyond 2020. Or it's computed out here about 56 years. That assumes an orderly evolution. That says that a child born, say, within the last 10 years will probably see the world consume most of its oil if he lives a normal life.
In his lifetime.
Now, their OPEC countries are tampering with this curve right now. They're actually curtailing production somewhat. And so it's conceivable that this peak up here might be shifted over to the backside a little bit. We might cut off this rate of growth and stabilize. If we did, that would extend this middle 80% by about something like 10 years maybe. But it doesn't alter the basic thing that I'm saying significantly. To appreciate again the situation of our modern industrial society is contrasted, say, with past future with regard to the fossil fuels, or to appreciate the fossil fuels in human history. I've taken this time span here from 5,000 years ago to the present to 5,000 years in the future. Now, what we call recorded history began about 5,000 years ago. So what this shows is that this Washington Monument-like spike here is the episode of the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, and every other kind of fossil fuel in human history.
Mm.
It's the most disturbing thing that's ever happened to the human species. It's responsible for our technological society, and in terms of human history, it's a very brief epoch.
Well, presumably mankind has no intention of going backwards. What are our options for the future?
Well, we have to go back and look and see what the choices are. So we look at this first diagram again. We've talked about the fossil fuels principally here, but let's look at the others. Well, water power. We have water power. Where are we here? That's this one. And but it only amounts to about 3 or 4% of the energy of the United States, for example, our water power.
Yes.
In the world, less than that, perhaps. If we measure all of the rivers in the world, approximately, how much power would they produce if fully developed? It's about half the rate at which we're consuming energy worldwide right now. Well, we've only developed it to about 8%, but the big undeveloped water power is in Africa and South America and Southeast Asia, and relatively unindustrialized areas. If fully developed, it's a very large supply of power. Now, wind, we used to use a lot of wind, and then we have farm windmills is about all that's left now. But we're taking another look at the wind. There's a lot of energy in the wind, and we're taking a serious look at it again. Now, we look at tidal energy. We've been talking about tidal energy in the Passamaquoddy, for example, for 50 years. The Canadians have just done a big engineering study of the whole Bay of Fundy. And the French have the only tidal power plant in the world right now is in France on La Rance Estuary.
Yes.
It's about a 320 megawatt plant, went into operation about 10 years ago. Now, but if we add up the total amount of energy in tidal, it's not very large, and if we added all the likely sites in the world, it's still only about 2 or 3% of potential water power. It isn't very big.
Yes.
Attractive in special cases. Well, where else?
Of nuclear?
Nuclear, yeah. Well, we're building nuclear plants right now at a great rate, both in the United States and elsewhere, although many of the contracts you may recall have been canceled within the last 2 or 3 years for various reasons. So this projected growth rate is rapidly slowing down.
What's bad about nuclear power?
Well, nuclear power depends on, at the present time, on uranium. And uranium actually has 2 parts. It's uranium-235, which is a scarce component. One atom out of 141 of natural uranium is U-235, but it's the only one we can use at present. It's naturally fissionable. The rest is U-238. Now, our power plants now operate on this rare isotope, and in the United States, the uranium-235 supply, in terms of requirements, looks like we're going to be in trouble in 10 or 15 years. The world maybe 10 or 15 years later. So, what can we do about that? Well, we talk about the breeder reactor where we can use the common uranium.
Yes.
And we're working on that now. And if accomplished successfully, the energy from uranium would be much bigger than the fossil fuels. Now, the difficulties are, however, of nuclear power, fission power, are threefold. One is that we have an enormous concentration of energy in a small space. These power plants, 1,000, 1,200 megawatts in a plant, sometimes 2 or 3 units together, 2 or 3 times that amount. Now, in fissioning, the fission products, the ashes, if you please, are highly radioactive materials. Some of them are dangerous for 1,000 years. And so if we keep finding these out, we have a problem of perpetual care. What are we going to do with these things?
Yes.
Keep them out of the biological system. There's another question, a problem. Well, the supply of fuel has already been mentioned. But then we have a problem of a world either at rest or at unrest. If we had a worldwide social rest for 1,000 years, we could handle these technological problems. But what are we going to do with saboteurs and bombs?
And just plain accidents.
Or accidents, industrial accidents, or illegal warfare,
Yes.
where you drop bombs just the same on plants and so on. When you put all this together, we're dealing actually with a very hazardous thing, perhaps the most hazardous thing the human species has ever got its hands on. So, looking at this, I think it makes most thoughtful people rather wish we had some other way of producing power than that. Well, is there any other way of the magnitude that we require? And we look again. We look around here. Well, one thing I didn't mention before, I briefly should, and that is we do have geothermal steam, volcanic steam. We have a plant in Geysers, California, the largest in the world, which is 500 megawatts. We have several plants in Italy averaging up about 400 megawatts. We have one of 160 megawatts in New Zealand. But still, this is a very special situation geologically, and it looks, as now, like maybe small as compared with water power.
Yes.
But then to get back to, now what is there else? We look around here, and about all we haven't mentioned so far is this solar input. Now forget about the part that the 30% that goes out. We have 120,000 trillion watts that are coming in here and are activating or effective in the Earth processes. Now, we know how to capture this energy. We know how to use it right now. And to illustrate this, I brought along a little solar power plant. This is silicon wafers like they use in these wings on spacecraft, which provide the utilities that keep the spacemen alive. And here's a little electric motor, merely so you can see something going on. Now, I'm going to turn on, or ask you to turn on some artificial sunshine on this little collector and see what happens. Can we?
Oh yeah, I see it starting.
Can we turn that on a little bit more? Oh yeah.
There it goes.
Okay. So here, this is actually an artificial light. In sunshine, this does the same thing. And so this little machine is converting light directly into electric power. It'll convert 10 or 12% of sunlight directly into electric power. That's one way of doing it. The other way is we can use heat. We can use a steam engine, etc. Now, an area about 4 miles square, collection area about 4 miles square, is equivalent to approximately 1,000 megawatt electrical power plant.
Just all from the sun?
Purely from sunshine. And once the thing is built, all it has is maintenance. You don't keep digging up the ground, you don't start polluting the atmosphere, etc. The energy available this way around the Earth would be just a postage stamp here and there on the map of the world, would supply all of the power the human species has any use for.
And we do have the technology to know how to do
We have the technology right now. We know how to do it. Yes, we don't build these big power plants to more money, but we know how. It takes a lot of development of equipment and so on. But we know how to do it now.
Well, in perspective, considering the past and the present and human affairs, what does the future look like?
Well, on a long-term view, I think that picture I showed you, the fossil fuels from 5,000 years ago to the present to 5,000 years in the future, was a very good clue to understanding the situation. So let's look at ourselves on that same scale. Let's look at the human population. Human population 5,000 years ago, we don't know just what it was, but it was a few million. It was only 500 million by 500 years ago, about, or 1,600. But now, then right after this, tied right in with this use of fossil fuels and this development of technology and energy and so on, was an ecological disturbance that affected, among other things, the human population. And so the population began to accelerate. It's now up to 4 billion, and it's doubling in 35 years about. In other words, another 35 years from now, we'll have twice as many people as we have now. And, well, you might get one sense of this. Suppose you could go back to 2 million years ago. Well, how many people were there a million years ago? We don't know, but I venture there weren't less than 2. We might call them Adam and Eve, if you like. Now, how many doublings would it be from then till now, starting with 2? Only 31. What would the average length of time of doubling, if you double 31 times a million years? About 32,000 years. We're now doubling it to 35 years. Now, what about the future? Well, you can't keep this up. A few more doublings and we'll have certainly more people than the Earth can accommodate. So then what? We must level off, stabilize. We might conceivably level off at some maximum level, such as 1 year, but far more likely we're going to drop down to a better level, one that's more compatible with the Earth's area and its resources, its food supply, etc., such as 2. That's biological stabilization. Now the energy, this 2 depends on our energy supply. And that is that if we, for example, ran out of energy or went into a technological decline, we'd be back down to a low energy level. Then we'd have to drop the population back to a level that could subsist like that. Now, on the other hand, if we maintain a high energy level, such as Roman 2 here, then we could maintain a human population. for a long time. I won't say indefinitely, but certainly for, well, I won't be responsible for the human race for more than 1,000 years. I'd say 1,000 years we could do it. No. So what you see is that we're dealing with a little sort of a window in history here of about 300 years that separates a past characterized by low energy levels and very slow rates of change. We've gone into a very disturbed state, rapidly changing state, and we're heading into, willy-nilly, into a slow changing state again, but it may be at a high energy level and a high standard of living.
Yes.
Or it may not be. It may go back down. So one of the foremost problems that we're confronted with right now is how do we get from where we are now over to a stable state such as 2 by the least catastrophic progression. Now to get back to what bearing that this has on the hospitals, actually one of our problems here is a problem of growth. You know, this word growth is one of the most sacred cow words in our vocabulary.
Yes.
We've never known anything except growth for the last 200 or 300 years. And we've kind of taken for granted it's always going to happen. Well, the growth problem doesn't concern the hospitals. The growth problem concerns the energy supply, oil and gas and electricity and so on.
But they've grown to a point where they require this.
And we are in this stage of high requirements, and also we're going into the declining stage. We are declining in gas production. We are declining in oil production. And so there's undoubtedly going to be a very tight situation during the next few decades. And the hospitals are going to be, in the health institutions, are going to be very intimately concerned with this problem.
Certainly.
So then what can they do besides the conventional sources of power? Well, about the most obvious thing is that they'd better start taking a very serious look at solar energy in their institutions, the collection of solar energy for heating, they're insulating their buildings, etc., things of that sort. And we're not dealing with an intractable problem, but the time it takes to adjust to it is going to take a little while. And this is what they're going to be concerned with.
Well, Dr. Hubbert, we've run out of time. I want to thank you very much for a somewhat alarming, but I think toward the end, somewhat reassuring conversation. And I'd like to thank you for joining us.